She tried not to stare. Everything she had ever been taught, every warning from her superiors, every fear that had kept her alive for months, screamed at her to look away. But she couldn't. The sight of the British soldier, standing tall and resolute, was like a magnet pulling her gaze. In that moment, as the cold wind whipped around the barbed wire fences of the prisoner of war camp, Anneliese Müller felt the weight of her upbringing clash violently with the reality before her. The camp was a grim shadow of what had once been, a scattered collection of tattered tents and makeshift shelters, standing in stark contrast to the verdant fields that surrounded it. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and the distant echoes of artillery fire, a reminder that the war was not yet over, even as the world around her began to change. Anneliese, a mere 22 years old, had spent the last 2 years of her life in this purgatory, a prisoner of her own homeland's choices. Her heart raced as she stood there, her mind a chaotic whirlpool of fear, confusion, and an unexpected flicker of curiosity. Private Thomas Reynolds, just 25, was a soldier forged in the fires of conflict. Though he wore the uniform of an enemy, there was an unmistakable humanity in his eyes. Anneliese had been taught to see him as a monster, a face of all that was wrong with the world. Yet, as she observed him now, there was an unsettling familiarity in his expression, a reflection of her own fears and hopes. He was just a man, standing amongst the remnants of a war that had consumed their lives. The bitter chill of the day seeped into Anneliese's bones, yet the heat of her internal struggle burned fiercely. She was torn between the loyalty instilled in her from childhood, a loyalty that had been nurtured by propaganda and fervent nationalism, and the dawning realization that perhaps this man, this so-called enemy, was just as human as she was. Her upbringing had painted him as a caricature of evil, yet here he stood, appearing weary and burdened, as if he too bore the weight of the world on his shoulders. This single moment would redefine her entire world, a voice in her mind whispered, even as her heart raced with the urgency of the situation. Before they could explore the reasons why, she found herself wondering how many others felt the same conflict, that the lines drawn between them were nothing more than illusions, painted with the brush of fear and hatred. The prisoner of war camp was not just a place of confinement, it was a crucible of transformation. Anneliese had witnessed the slow degradation of her fellow prisoners, their spirits crushed by the relentless grind of captivity, while whispers of a new reality began to circulate among them. There were murmurs about the British soldiers, rumors that spoke of their unexpected kindness, tales that contradicted everything they had been taught. As she stood among the other women, clad in the ragged uniforms that had become their second skin, Anneliese caught snippets of conversation that ignited her curiosity. "I heard one of them gave a piece of bread to a child," a fellow prisoner had said just days before. Another spoke of how a soldier had shared a photograph of his family, revealing a glimpse of humanity amidst the chaos. Each story felt like a crack in the wall of her indoctrination, a reminder that the enemy was not a monolith of evil, but a tapestry woven with individual threads of pain and hope. Yet the fear remained, a specter that haunted her thoughts. What if these were just tricks to soften their resolve? What if trust was a luxury they could not afford? And yet the more she observed Thomas and his fellow soldiers, the more she felt an unfamiliar stirring within her, a burgeoning desire to understand, to connect, to see beyond the uniforms. As she watched him from a distance, his posture relaxed but alert, Anneliese felt an ache in her chest. The world around her was a cacophony of fear and uncertainty, but in that moment she began to question everything she had ever known. The lines of loyalty, right and wrong, were blurring before her eyes, and the man she had been taught to despise was becoming a person, a human being with a life, a story, a family, waiting for him back home. The cold wind continued to whip around her, but within the confines of her heart, something began to thaw. Anneliese felt the stirrings of a profound internal conflict, one that would challenge her beliefs and reshape her understanding of what it meant to be human in a world torn apart by war. Would she dare to look deeper, to explore the forbidden thoughts that danced in her mind? The battle within her had only just begun. The cold, damp air of the camp wrapped around Anneliese like a heavy shroud as she tried to steady her breath. The distant rumble of artillery echoed in her mind, a constant reminder of the war that had enveloped her very existence. Yet in the midst of chaos, it was the soldier's presence that resonated most profoundly. Private Thomas Reynolds, with his dark hair tousled by the wind, seemed to embody a world she had been taught to fear. Yet the hesitance in his eyes, the way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, revealed a vulnerability that she had never associated with the enemy. As the days dragged on in the prison camp, Annalisa found herself caught in a web of conflicting emotions. Each morning, she would awake in her narrow bunk, the smell of damp straw and the remnants of yesterday's meager rations lingering in the air. The sight of her fellow prisoners, gaunt and weary, reminded her of the struggle they all faced, yet beneath their shared suffering lay an unspoken tension. They clung to the narratives they had grown up with, the ideas that painted the British as monsters, relentless and cruel, and yet with every glance at Thomas, Annalisa felt that perception begin to fracture. One cold afternoon, as she stood in line for her ration of soup, she overheard a group of prisoners discussing the soldiers assigned to guard them. A voice, sharp and filled with contempt, cut through the murmurs. "They're just waiting for the chance to shoot us, to show us how little our lives mean to them." The words hung heavy in the air, and Annalisa felt a familiar tightening in her stomach, the reflexive fear that had been instilled in her from childhood. But as she turned to look at Thomas, who was joking lightly with another guard, her heart twisted in a way she hadn't anticipated. He didn't seem like a monster. The way he laughed, the way he interacted with the other soldiers, was so different from the image she had been fed. She recalled snippets of her upbringing, the endless propaganda that painted the Allies as ruthless aggressors, intent on the destruction of everything they held dear. Yet here was Thomas, a man, not a monster, navigating the complexities of a war that had stripped them all of their humanity. The rumbles of artillery echoed in the distance, a grim reminder of the conflict that still loomed over them. Annalisa felt a chill run down her spine, not just from the cold, but from the reality of her situation. The whispers of her fellow prisoners echoed in her mind, the fear they expressed only serving to deepen her own uncertainty. What if they were right? What if the soldiers around her were as cruel as she had been taught? The internal struggle left her feeling isolated, caught between the propaganda of her past and the burgeoning understanding of her present. Days turned into weeks, and the small acts of kindness from the guards began to chip away at her ingrained beliefs. She observed Thomas, who would occasionally offer an extra piece of bread to a starving prisoner or share a laugh with the others, even in the face of their dire circumstances. These small gestures painted a stark contrast to the hatred she expected. As the winter chill set in, Annalisa often found herself watching him from a distance, her thoughts a chaotic mix of fear, curiosity, and a burgeoning sense of empathy. One evening, as dusk settled over the camp, Annalisa sat on a bench outside her barrack, the sky painted in hues of deep purple and orange. She felt a warmth radiating from the tiny fire used for cooking, yet her heart was heavy with confusion. Her mind raced back to her childhood, to the stern faces of her teachers who had instructed her on loyalty to the fatherland, emphasizing the horrors of the enemy. She had been taught to dehumanize them, to view them as less than human, but now the flickering shadows of the fire seemed to dance around the very idea that had shaped her. "Why do you stare at him so?" a voice interrupted her thoughts. It was Greta, one of the other prisoners, her voice laced with suspicion. Greta had always been wary of the guards, her fear palpable, and Annalisa could see the tension in her posture. "He's just waiting for a chance to hurt us. You shouldn't let your guard down." Annalisa looked at Greta, her heart pounding. "I can't help it. He's different." The admission slipped out before she could stop it, and a chill ran through her as she realized the implications of her words. "He's not like the others." "Don't be fooled, Annalisa," Greta warned, her eyes narrowing. "They wear masks to deceive us. We can't trust them." The fervor in her words was infectious, and Annalisa felt the weight of doubt press against her heart once more. But as the days turned into a blur of routine and monotony, her thoughts kept drifting back to Thomas. The more she observed him, the more she felt a strange connection beginning to form, one that transcended the barriers of war and ideology. It was both terrifying and exhilarating, Could she truly humanize the enemy she had been raised to despise? One afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Annalisa found herself gathering her courage. She had overheard whispers of a potential transfer of prisoners to another camp, and the thought filled her with dread. Would she have the chance to see Thomas again? What if this was her last opportunity to understand him, to bridge the chasm created by months of propaganda and hatred? The moment lingered in her mind, a defining point that could alter the course of her life. She had to know if the humanity she sensed in him was real or just a figment of her imagination. Her heart raced as she approached the fence that separated them. The barbed wire seemed to glimmer ominously in the fading light, a physical reminder of the divide that lay between them. She took a deep breath, gathering her resolve. "Private Reynolds," she called, her voice steady despite the tremor of her heart. He turned. Surprise etched across his features as he caught sight of her. "Can I ask you something?" His brow furrowed, and for a moment, Annalisa felt the weight of her question pressing down on her. Would he see her as an enemy? Would he dismiss her? But Thomas stepped closer, curiosity shining in his eyes, and she felt a flicker of hope ignite within her. "This is a dangerous game you're playing," he said softly, his voice low enough to prevent the others from hearing. "Why are you risking this?" With her heart pounding, she looked into his eyes, searching for an answer to the questions that plagued her. "Because I see you. I see you being kind when no one expects it. I see you breaking the mold." His expression softened, confusion mingling with intrigue. "You shouldn't trust me. You don't know what I'm capable of." "But I don't believe the stories anymore," she replied, her voice trembling with the weight of her confession. "I want to understand what it means to be human, to connect beyond this war." In that moment, as the shadows of the camp enveloped them, Annalisa felt the walls of her upbringing begin to crumble. The stakes were high, and the path ahead was fraught with uncertainty, but the desire to connect, to break free from the chains of fear and hatred, surged within her. Before she could say more, a shout from one of the guards echoed through the camp, breaking the fragile moment. "Get back to your barracks!" The command reverberated, sending a jolt of fear through Annalisa. She glanced back at Thomas, their eyes locking for a brief second, a silent understanding passing between them. As she turned to leave, the weight of her actions settled upon her shoulders. She had crossed an invisible line, one that could lead to dangerous consequences. Yet, the flicker of humanity she had glimpsed in Thomas kept her moving forward. In the days that followed, Annalisa couldn't shake the interaction from her mind. Each time she saw Thomas, a mix of anxiety and anticipation washed over her. She was aware of the danger that lay in her growing attachment to him, but the desire to understand, to break free from the shackles of her indoctrination, compelled her forward. What if the enemy was not so different from her? What if, beneath the uniforms and the ideologies, they shared common hopes and fears? The very thought was both liberating and terrifying, challenging everything she had been taught. As the sun dipped below the horizon one evening, casting long shadows across the camp, Annalisa found herself questioning everything. She had begun to see the world through a different lens, one that invited empathy into a harsh reality. But with the whispers of impending transfers growing louder, the stakes continued to rise. Would she have the courage to confront her fears? Would she be able to bridge the divide that separated her from Thomas? Or would the war pull them apart forever? If you're intrigued by Annalisa and Thomas's journey and want to explore more stories that challenge our perceptions of history and humanity, join our community. Subscribe to our channel and let's dive deeper into the untold narratives that shape our understanding of the past. Your support helps us keep these important stories alive. Thank you for being part of our journey. Annalisa felt the cold wash over her like a wave, the chill seeping into her bones as she stood on the edge of the makeshift compound. The barbed wire, twisted and rusting, seemed to loom like a monstrous barrier, separating her world from that of the British soldier, Private Thomas Reynolds. He was just a few feet away, his uniform a stark contrast to the drab, tattered clothes she wore, which were stained with dirt and grime from days of neglect. Her heart raced as she struggled to reconcile the image of the enemy that had been drilled into her since childhood with the humanity she saw in his eyes. Those deep blue eyes, filled with an unexpected warmth, made her pulse quicken. Everything she had learned screamed at her to look away, to refuse this moment of connection. Yet, she remained transfixed, caught in a web of conflicting emotions. This was the moment she had dreaded, the exact confrontation she had feared would unearth the buried fragments of her conscience. The propaganda that had filled her mind with hate now felt like a shackle, heavy and suffocating. She fought against it, but her gaze lingered, drawn to Thomas as though he were a beacon in the darkness of her indoctrination. The distant rumble of a truck approaching broke the tension, and Annalise's heart sank. She knew that the arrival of new guards could mean punishment for any sign of weakness. But something in Thomas's stance told her he was different. He was not just a soldier, he was a person, and that fact terrified her. Suddenly she felt the urge to flee, to retreat to the safety of her own thoughts. But just as she turned, she caught sight of him looking back, his brow furrowed with concern. "Are you all right?" His voice was deep, yet gentle, cutting through the cold air like a knife. Annalisa hesitated, her throat tightening. What could she say? Words felt foreign, tangled in her mind. Instead, she nodded, though the gesture felt hollow. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, a collision of worlds and beliefs. "Please," he continued, stepping closer, "you don't have to be afraid. We're not your enemies." A surge of anger flared within her, a protective instinct born from years of conditioning. How dare he speak to her like that? Yet, beneath the anger lay a flicker of curiosity, a yearning for understanding that had been stifled for far too long. Annalisa turned away, her heart pounding. She needed to regain control, to shield herself from this unexpected softness. But something inside her whispered that she would never be able to unsee what she had just seen. Days passed, each one blending into the next like the grey clouds that hung perpetually over the camp. The routine was monotonous, punctuated only by the arrival of food rations and the occasional scuffle between guards and prisoners. Annalisa had learned to keep her head down, but her thoughts often drifted back to Thomas. One evening, as she sat on the damp ground, her stomach rumbling in protest, she caught sight of him again. He was handing out rations, his movements efficient yet careful, as if he were aware of the fragility surrounding him. Annalisa watched as he offered a piece of bread to a fellow prisoner, a young girl who looked no older than 12. The girl's eyes lit up with gratitude, and for a moment Annalisa's heart swelled with an unfamiliar feeling. Hope. That night, something shifted within her. She couldn't ignore the growing connection she felt toward the British soldier. What if everything she had been taught was wrong? What if the true enemy was the hatred that had been instilled in her? No longer could she deny the humanity she saw in Thomas, the kindness that contradicted the narrative she had been fed. The next day, Annalisa made her way to the far edge of the camp, her heart pounding. She needed to speak to him, to confront the conflict that was consuming her. The air was heavy with the scent of rain as dark clouds rolled in, casting an ominous shadow over the camp. "Thomas!" she called out, her voice trembling as she stepped forward. He turned, surprise flickering in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by concern. "What is it?" he asked, moving closer, cautious yet curious. I need to talk to you." Her voice was barely above a whisper, the weight of her words nearly choking her. He nodded, glancing around to ensure they were alone. "Come on, let's find a quieter place." They slipped behind a row of tents, the sound of the wind rustling the fabric around them. Annalise could feel the tension crackling between them, an electric charge that made her skin prickle. "I have been thinking," she began, her voice shaky, "about everything. About us. I don't know what to believe anymore." Thomas's expression softened. "It's okay, you're not alone in this. I feel the same way." The confession hung in the air, heavy with implication. Annalisa took a breath, her heart racing. "You're not like them," she said, her eyes searching his for understanding. "You're not the monster I was taught to fear." He stepped closer, his gaze steady. "And you're not the enemy I was told to hate. We're all just people trying to survive this madness." The words struck her like a physical blow. How could he understand her so well? She felt vulnerable, exposed in a way that both terrified and exhilarated her. "But there are rules. We're not supposed to talk, to connect. They'll punish us." His expression hardened slightly. "I know, but sometimes breaking the rules is the only way to find truth." In that moment, Annalise's resolve began to crumble. She had spent so long believing in the divide, in the hatred that had been instilled in her. But here was this soldier, defying everything she had ever known, and it shook her to her core. "Can you tell me about your family?" she blurted out, desperation creeping into her voice. Thomas hesitated, his features tightening for just a moment before he pulled out a small, worn photograph from his pocket. He held it out for her to see. "This is my sister Mary. She's just a year younger than you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She's waiting for me to come home." Annalisa took the photograph, her fingers brushing against the paper. The girl in the picture was laughing, her eyes sparkling with joy, the kind of innocence that war sought to destroy. "She's beautiful," Annalisa said softly, handing it back. "I miss her every day. I joined the army to protect people like her, to fight for a future where she can live without fear." The vulnerability in his voice resonated deeply within her. Annalisa felt the walls she had built around her heart begin to crumble. "I was raised to believe you were all monsters," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you're just a person, just like me." A flicker of hope ignited in Thomas's eyes. "We're all products of our upbringing, but we can choose to see beyond it. We can choose kindness." Just as the weight of their shared humanity began to settle in, the sound of shouting erupted from the direction of the barracks. Annalise's heart plummeted. "They're coming! Go! You have to hide!" Thomas urged, his voice urgent. "No, I can't leave you." She felt panic rise in her chest, the thought of abandoning him tearing at her insides. "Just go, Annalisa." His voice was firm now, leaving no room for argument. "If they catch you here, it will be worse for both of us." With a final glance, she turned and ran, her heart racing as she ducked behind a row of tents, her mind racing with the implications of their conversation. The world around her felt like it was collapsing as she pressed herself against the cold fabric, her thoughts spiraling into chaos. The shouts grew louder, and she could hear the heavy boots of the guards marching through the camp. Her breath came in quick bursts, the fear clenching her stomach. Moments later, she caught sight of Thomas being pulled from the tent by two guards, his hands raised in surrender. "He was talking to her!" one of them shouted, pointing in her direction. Annalisa's heart sank as she realized the danger he was in because of her, because of their fragile connection. "No!" she cried out, her voice breaking, but it was too late. They were dragging him away, and she could only watch in horror as he shot her one last look, a mixture of fear and regret etched into his features. Annalisa's world shattered in that moment. The truth she had begun to embrace felt like a cruel joke as she stood frozen, unable to move, the weight of her choices crashing down around her. She had wanted to know him, to understand him, yet the very act of reaching out had put his life in danger. As the guards disappeared with Thomas, anger and despair surged through her, mingling with the remnants of hope that had briefly flickered to life. She knew she had to act, to do something to save him, but how could she fight against a system that had been designed to break them? In the days that followed, Annalisa found herself torn between fear and determination. She began to notice the small acts of kindness that echoed in the camp, the whispers of rebellion against the coldness that surrounded them. The other prisoners, too, had begun to question the narrative they had been fed, just as she had. But it was Thomas's fate that haunted her. What punishment awaited him for their brief encounter? The thought gnawed at her, each passing moment feeling like an eternity. Driven by the memory of his gentle smile and the warmth of his words, Annalisa made a decision. She would not let his sacrifice be in vain. She would find a way to reach him, to make the guards understand that he was not the enemy, that he was a man fighting for a future. And as she plotted her course, she realized that the real battle lay not just in the camp, but within herself. It was a battle against the indoctrination that had shaped her life, a fight for the humanity that connected them all. In the depths of despair, she whispered to herself, "We are not enemies, we are just people." In that moment, Annalisa vowed to embrace the truth she had discovered, no matter the cost. She would become the voice that challenged the hatred and the fear, and in doing so, she hoped to forge a path toward understanding, a path that could perhaps alter the course of her life and the lives of those around her. And as the shadows of war continued to engulf them, one truth remained clear. The whisper of hope was the most powerful weapon they could wield against the darkness. The days following that fateful encounter with Private Thomas Reynolds unfolded like a delicate tapestry, each thread woven with newfound understanding and an undeniable sense of humanity. Annalisa's heart was a battleground of conflicting emotions, struggling to reconcile the indoctrination of her past with the vivid reality of the soldier who had shown her a glimpse of compassion. The whispers of her upbringing echoed in her mind, yet they began to fade, replaced by a burgeoning awareness of the complexity of human experience. In the days that followed, Annalisa found herself observing the world around her with an attentive eye, no longer merely a passive participant in her own life. The camp buzzed with the muted conversations of her fellow prisoners, each one grappling with their own fears and resentments. She noticed how they spoke of the guards, often with contempt and hatred, yet she could not shake the memory of Thomas's kind gesture. It gnawed at her, challenging her perceptions and forcing her to confront the uncomfortable truths of her upbringing. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a warm golden hue over the camp, Annalisa found herself standing by the fence, her gaze fixed on the distant figure of Thomas. He was laughing with a fellow soldier, a sound so foreign and yet so inviting that it stirred something deep within her. It wasn't just laughter. It was a moment of levity in a world rife with despair. And in that moment, Annalisa felt the stirrings of a decision forming within her, a desire to connect, to break down the walls that had been built by fear and hatred. As the days turned into weeks, Annalisa's resolve grew stronger. She began to take small steps. At first, it was through fleeting glances and shy smiles exchanged with Thomas, moments that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. Each encounter became a lifeline, a thread connecting her to a reality that contradicted everything she had been taught. Thomas, with his gentle nature and willingness to listen, became a beacon of hope, illuminating the darkness that had surrounded her for so long. One day, emboldened by her growing sense of agency, Annalisa approached the fence while Thomas was on guard duty. Her heart raced, but she steeled herself, knowing that this was a pivotal moment. "Thomas!" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried the weight of her courage. He turned, surprise evident in his blue eyes, and smiled that warm smile that had begun to thaw the ice encasing her heart. "Annalisa," he replied, his tone inviting and friendly, as if they were old friends rather than soldier and prisoner. I wanted to thank you," she stammered, her courage faltering for a moment, "for what you did, sharing your food." The words felt inadequate, but she pressed on. "It made me see something different. I've always thought of you as the enemy, but now—" Her voice trembled, uncertainty creeping back in. "Now I see you are human, just like me." Thomas's expression softened, and for a moment the barriers that defined them as adversaries seemed to dissolve. "We are all caught in this war, Annalise. We all have our stories, our fears. It's easy to see each other as monsters when we're fighting for our lives, but I believe there's more that connects us than divides us." In that exchange, Annalisa felt the chains of her past begin to shatter. The weight of propaganda, the indoctrination that had shaped her beliefs, began to lift as she recognized the truth in his words. She was no longer merely a product of her upbringing. She was a person capable of empathy and connection. Days turned into a routine of cautious exchanges, each one deepening their bond. They shared stories of their lives before the war, their dreams and their fears. Annalisa spoke of her family, her childhood in a Germany that felt so far removed from the present. Thomas shared tales of his own upbringing in England, the love for his family that drove him to fight, and the dreams he had for a world free of conflict. As their friendship blossomed, Annalisa found herself transforming in ways she had never imagined possible. The bitterness that had once clouded her heart began to give way to understanding and compassion. She started to glimpse the shared humanity in those around her, both within the camp and beyond its confines. The soldiers, once seen as faceless enemies, began to take shape as individuals with their own stories and struggles. However, this newfound perspective was not without its challenges. Annalisa faced skepticism from her fellow prisoners who could not fathom why she would engage with the enemy. "They are the cause of our suffering," one woman spat, her voice dripping with venom. "You risk everything by speaking to them." Yet, Annalisa stood firm, her resolve bolstered by the belief that true change began with understanding. "Maybe they are the cause of our suffering," she replied, her voice steady. "But they're also people. If we continue to see them as monsters, we'll never find peace. I refuse to be a puppet of hatred any longer." Her words resonated with some, causing ripples of doubt in the staunch beliefs held by others. Some began to see the possibility of breaking the cycle of animosity, while others remained entrenched in their anger, unable to see beyond the pain of their circumstances. As the war drew to a close, the camp underwent significant changes. Rumors of impending liberation spread like wildfire, filling the air with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Annalisa struggled with the reality that the life she had come to understand would soon be upended once again. She could no longer view her future through the lens of a prisoner. She had become a part of something larger, a movement towards empathy and understanding. On the day of liberation, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Annalisa stood at the fence, her heart racing as she caught sight of Thomas among the soldiers preparing to leave. She felt a pang of sadness at the thought of their friendship being disrupted by the end of the war. "Annalisa!" he called out, rushing to her side, his expression a mixture of joy and concern. "Are you all right? You'll be free soon." "I know," she replied, her voice trembling with emotion. "But I'm afraid of what comes next. I've learned so much from you, I don't want to lose that." "We won't lose it," he said, his gaze steady and reassuring. "This experience has changed us both. Remember, the world will need people who can bridge divides and foster understanding. You have the power to do that, Annalisa." As the gates of the camp swung open, Annalisa felt a rush of conflicting emotions, joy mingled with sorrow, hope intertwined with uncertainty. She knew that her journey was just beginning. The world beyond those gates was fraught with challenges, but it was also filled with endless possibilities. With a deep breath, she stepped forward, ready to embrace her newfound purpose. No longer a passive victim of circumstance, Annalisa was determined to advocate for compassion and understanding, to share her story and the lessons she had learned. She would no longer allow hatred to define her or the relationships she would forge in the future. As she turned to say goodbye to Thomas, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. "Thank you for everything," she whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. "You showed me a world beyond fear. I will carry that with me always." "Promise me you won't forget him," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "And remember, one act of kindness can change the course of someone's life." "Promise," she affirmed, knowing that this was not merely a farewell, but a vow to embody the spirit of empathy that had blossomed between them. As Annalisa stepped into the unknown, she glanced back one last time at Thomas. In that fleeting moment, she realized that the boundaries of war had not only separated nations, they had also concealed the shared humanity that connected them all. With hope lighting her path, she embraced the future, determined to be a voice for understanding in a world that had too often succumbed to hatred. The story of Annalisa and Thomas is a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the potential for connection and compassion exists. It is a testament to the power of empathy to transcend borders and break down the walls built by fear. If you've been touched by Annalisa's journey and believe in the importance of sharing stories that remind us of our shared humanity, we invite you to join our community. Subscribe to our channel, leave a comment about how stories like this resonate with you, and help us continue to shine light on the narratives that unite us all. Your support is vital in bringing these powerful stories to life. Thank you for watching.